Welcome to Hashkafa with a Heretic, where we explore the works of Hashkafa that are often recommended to people with questions of Emunah to lay our doubts and keep us on the derech. I blog as the second son, and I'm your heretical host. Are there really answers to all the questions? Are kashis really terutzim? Are we stark apikorsim or stam amaratzim? Let's find out. Episode 2, Chovos HaLevavos, Part 2. In this week's episode, we continue the introduction to Chovos HaLevavos. The author explains why he wrote the book and lambasts those who think that Emunah Pshut is superior to real understanding. He discusses his insecurities and advises us not to be overly prudent. He also repeats the canard that the only reason people will question Judaism is to excuse their taivas, and more or less says that only lazy, weak-willed people wouldn't find his arguments convincing. Too bad. I'll risk being labeled a lazy, weak-willed hedonist, and critically examine his arguments anyway. Last week we started on the intro to Chovos HaLevavos, and we left off in the middle of the part where the author was explaining why he wrote the book and his exploration of why such a book didn't exist yet, and he went through various ideas that maybe there wasn't enough material, maybe someone else had written it, and he was always finding that no, there needs to be such a book, and so he wrote it. Now here's something for all those people who talk about the world today and how terrible it is and how we are so he writes that perhaps there wasn't such a book on this subject because it wasn't necessary and everybody knows all this stuff, so why would you bother writing a book? But he says that he found that this isn't true from reading history and I quote, and all the more so, for most of the people in our generation who neglect even the commandments of the limbs, not to mention the commandments of the hearts, and if any one of them is roused to devote himself to the study of the Torah, his motive in this is to be called a wise man by the masses, and to gain for himself a name among the great. And thus he strays from the way of the Torah to things which neither aid him in ascending spiritually, nor save him from spiritually stumbling. So, this apparent lack of piety is something that goes way, way back, which of course we know going, back as far as we have any records, even in Tanakh itself. It discusses how the Bnei Yisrael were misbehaving and worshipping idols, and of course the spin that Tanakh gives it is these were horrible deviants, and not in fact the majority that it actually was. But we see here that there have always been people decrying the degenerate generation in which they live, and how most people are not living up to what they should be. Then he asks, is it enough to accept proper beliefs simply from tradition, what has become to be called Emunah Pshuta? And this is great. He says, namely, that we declare like the simpleton and the fool, God is one, without argument or proof, or if we are under duty to investigate through rational inquiry the distinction between true unity versus relative unity. He clearly was not a fan of Emunah Pshuta, and he thought, well, to paraphrase Plato, that the unexamined faith is not worth having, that one must understand what he is claiming to believe, and it's not enough to just say, I believe Emunah Pshuta, or I believe because Rabbi so-and-so said so, and I trust him. And he brings a proof that the Torah says, therefore know this day and consider with your heart that the Lord is God in heaven and on the earth below. There is none other. So he holds that it's a mitzvah min HaTorah to understand what you are believing in, and Emunah Pshuta is not enough. He tells a story about a Talmud Chacham who was consulted about what he calls a strange case on the laws of divorce, and the Talmud Chacham told the guy asking him that what's the point? This is a case that's not going to come up. It does you no harm not to know about it, and no good to know about it. You should be doing is studying and trying to understand the point of the mitzvahs. So this question that you're asking about the divorce laws is not going to help you at all. The case is not relevant, and it's not going to make you a better person. It's not going to help you keep the mitzvahs better. So I like this, because the inquirer in this case could be every yeshiva guy now, where it's an odd quirk of the frum world today that doesn't address questions of Hashkafa, not as a matter of policy. You have what are called Hashkafa classes, which really are a few bad proofs and inspiring stories. But philosophy, never. According to the Chovos HaLevavos, though, going through all the odd cases in the Gemara are less useful than studying Hashkafa, real theology and philosophy. It's nice that within the canon, within the traditional accepted canon, and the Chovos HaLevavos certainly is an accepted sefer in the frum world, there are grounds to say that studying theology is a good thing, and that all those people who tell us, why do you need to think about this stuff? Just accept it, and it's a beautiful thing. Don't look so closely, and be happy, and you'd be better off not thinking about this stuff. I don't know how many times people told me that. You can say, well, no, the Chovos HaLevavos says it holds differently. He says that we should think about these things, that keeping the mitzvahs without the understanding is not worthwhile. Mindlessly parroting Ani Mamons, that's a little anachronistic, but mindlessly parroting principles which we don't understand is worthless, and learning obscure cases is not, it's a waste of time. You should be focusing on important things like understanding what you're doing, understanding theological principles. He tells another story how he once asked the respected Talmid Chacham about some of the topics that he's going to discuss in this book. And the Talmid Chacham told him that on these things it's enough to hold by tradition, that the Masorah, we can trust the Masorah, and we don't have to think about it. We don't have to investigate it or subject it to rational inquiry. And he replied, well, basically he said this only applies to stupid people. That for stupid people, it's good enough to just accept the Masorah or to trust that because Hashem said to do it, that's a good enough reason to do it, and it's not important to understand it. But for those who are capable of understanding, someone who doesn't look into it, not only is that not sufficient, he'll be punishment. He says, certainly he'll be punished for this, and he sins for having neglected them. So again, the whole frum world today, according to the Chovos HaLevavos, would be punished for having neglected paying due attention to theology. He also says, and that he says, the exact words that he uses is such as women and children or feeble-minded persons. Now, the translator put in a note. It says, women used to be much less educated than in our times. Which is true, but this is sort of a chicken and egg thing. Women were less educated because it was believed that they weren't capable of being educated. And because they were believed not to be capable of being educated, they weren't educated, and so they didn't seem as intelligent on average as an educated man. And then that could be pointed to as proof of women are not as intelligent as men. And it just goes around and around in a circle. This lumping together of women and children and the feeble-minded is we see this all the time. It's a standard line in the Gemara. It's shall we say, deeply unfortunate. It's also common. This was a commonly held a truism in the ancient and medieval world, that women just were not as smart as men. Women were children. Keep that in mind, and it explains basically everything about the traditional attitude towards women. If women are 10-year-olds, then this is not misogyny in the sense of hating women. This is because, and any more than we hate our children. We don't hate 10-year-olds. We love our kids, and we don't allow our kids to do certain things because we love them, because it's not a child's place to do these things, and we don't allow children to be in positions of authority because 10-year-olds they're 10 and they're great and we love them and we want what's best for them and we put a lot of effort into them. But can you imagine allowing a 10-year-old to be in charge of even of a shul, let alone of a country or a company or an institution? It's ridiculous. And if you think of women as children, allowing a woman to be in charge is ridiculous. He goes on to say that he became convinced that it's important to investigate the reasons and to rationally prove to oneself why one should do the mitzvahs and all the precepts of Judaism. And then he brings a bunch of proof texts from Tanakh. Once he accepted that it was necessary to understand theology and to rationally prove to oneself that Judaism is correct and that the mitzvahs are all rational, he says that he began to study them and train himself, and learning about one thing led him to another thing and led him to another thing, and he started taking, it became too much to keep track of just in his mind, so he started taking notes, and that notes grew into this book. So then he says that once he had decided to write the book, then it occurred to him that he wasn't great enough to write such a book. Who was he to write about such important matters? So he decided that he wasn't going to write this book. And then after a little while after that, he started thinking that maybe the reason that I decided not to write the book is because I'm lazy. And so he decided to write the book. And this reminds me of something I came across when I first discovered the Jewish skeptic blogs. There was a blogger called Balabos who had a post about how he had kept the mitzvahs meticulously for years after losing Emunah, because he felt that maybe the reason that he had all these questions was that he didn't want to keep the mitzvahs. He bought into the Taivas Kanar, that the only reason that anyone ever has doubts or goes off the derech is because they want to wallow in their Taivas. So he decided that he would keep the mitzvahs, and he kept the mitzvahs for a year or 2 years until it got to the point that it started to feel ridiculous and he started to drop some things. Over the years, I've come across different people who've said the same thing, that they were worried that their questions were really terutzim, and the reason that they had all of these questions was just to excuse their taivas, so they kept keeping the mitzvahs meticulously for months or years after coming to the conclusion that Yiddishkeit doesn't hold water. You can make yourself crazy like this. He says, I remember the saying, it is part of prudence not to be overly prudent. So this is good advice, right? Don't worry that it's the Yetzer Hara planting questions in your head to make you do Averis. Questions are questions, and if you don't find the answers within a reasonable amount of time, after a reasonable amount of research, it's reasonable to conclude that there aren't good answers, and to accept the consequences of that conclusion. And if there are no good answers, and if Yiddishkeit is not the truth, why bother? Unless, of course, you have other reasons for being from. But without those, right, pointing to people going off the derech because they have questions, and then saying, well, those questions were really just terutzim to excuse their going off the derech, is getting it backwards. It's an interplay of many, many different things, of intellectual problems, and not fitting in the community, or not having warm fuzzy feelings towards the community. Don't dismiss questions as excusing taivas. That someone stops keeping mitzvahs after he doesn't find sufficient answers to his questions, well, what should he do? Keep keeping the mitzvahs even though he has no reason to anymore? That's silly. Of course, once somebody stops believing, he's going to stop practicing, unless he has other reasons that have nothing to do with the legitimacy of Yiddishkeit. And ironically, those reasons can only be emotional reasons. As for all the people who are accused of going off the derech because they're of emotional reasons as opposed to intellectual reasons, as if emotion isn't a good reason to do something. Once the intellectual reasons for keeping mitzvahs go away, the only possible reason left is emotional, because you do it, not to hurt the people close to you, or you do it because you have warm, fuzzy associations with from practice, or to stay in your community. These are all emotional reasons. They're perfectly valid reasons, but they're emotional. They're not intellectual. And so there's a certain irony there that people are accused of going off the derech for emotional reasons. But once you lose the intellectual part of frumkeit, the only reason to stay is emotional. So now we come to the Chovos HaLevavos version of the Taivas Canard. He says, if a vision of lust appears to them and beckons them, they invent falsehood so that they may turn to it. They bolster up its arguments to make its deception seem upright, to strengthen its lies, to make firm its looseness. But when the light of truth invitingly shines before them, they make up idle pretexts to refrain from turning to it. They argue against it, declare its course is misleading, and contradict its assertions, so as to make it appear inconsistent, and thus have an excuse to part from it. In other words, right, the only reason you go off the derech is because you're following your taivas. And when someone shows you the truth, the Hashkafa farm, like the Chovos HaLevavos, for instance, you make up excuses why you explain it all away. Oh, this is not good and that is not good. But again, this is silly. Arguments stand or fall on their merits. If someone can disprove an argument or show the flaws in an argument, the fact that he's motivated to do so has nothing to do with anything. This is just trying to impugn those who offer counter arguments, and to say that they come up with all of these arguments in favor of their point of view so that they have excuses to do what they want. And when they're shown the truth, they try to poke holes in those arguments so they can continue to do what they want. Arguments are what they are. The truth is what it is. And if an argument doesn't hold water, it doesn't hold water, whatever the motivation of the person arguing is. There's actually a name for this. C.S. Lewis coined a name for this. He called it a bulverism. Basically, this is the argument that you want X to be true, therefore X is not true, which is ridiculous, right? If I'm hungry and therefore I want there to be food in my refrigerator, does that mean that there's no food in my refrigerator? Of course not. Either there is or there isn't. This is just a way to deflect arguments by explaining to the person making the argument why he wants the argument to be true. It is true or it's not true. Or, somewhere along that spectrum it has some probability of being true. But what the person making the argument wants to be true has nothing to do with anything. He continues with some discussion of his methods, and says that he's going to bring proofs from Tanakh, from the writing of Rabbanim, and from the writings of philosophers, and then he brings some proof texts from Tanakh and the Gemara showing that it's okay to quote non-Jewish philosophers. Then he lays out the format of the book and goes through what he's going to speak about. And then he again repeats this insulting claim. He says, his goal in writing the book was to bring sufficient proofs which reason can testify as to their soundness and truth, and which will only be disputed by the hypocritical and false people, because to such people truth is a burden on them, and their desire is to make things easier on themselves. So right away he's undercutting any counter arguments, because he's saying anyone who argues against me is a lazy person who doesn't want the truth because it's going to make life harder for them. So he was talking before about humility and how he humbly thought that maybe he wasn't the right person to write this book. There's no humility here. This is, I'm right, and only a lazy, good-for-nothing would suggest otherwise. He ends his introduction with a mashal about a king who gave silk to his servants, and how the wise servant used the silk wisely and found favor with the king, and the foolish servant used it foolishly and sold it and squandered the money on food and drink and ended up banished. And he encourages us to be like the wise servant and to use everything properly to gain favor in the eyes of the king, who of course is God. This is the end of the introduction. This episode will end here, and we'll continue next week with the first chapter, or as he calls it, the first gate. This has been Hashkafa with a Heretic. Until next week, keep questioning, and remember that kashas aren't teruts and insults aren't answers, and while there are many good reasons to be frum, the obvious truth of orthodoxy isn't one of them.